Thank you all for your patience as we get through our technical difficulties. Not that we've ever experienced any of those. Jake, thank you very much for your patience too. All right. Thank you very much for being here in our last breakout session of the day. I want to welcome Mark Whitworth to the stage. Mark has spent over 20 years as a solutions architect, advisor, and management consultant to Fortune 1000, higher education, large municipal customers, in roles ranging from VP of Information Assurance to Managing Partner and COO. As a principal advisor at WWT, he helps customers succeed in strategic and other complex initiatives related to security and compliance, data governance, AI, and operational experience. Looking forward to your session. Take it away.
All right. Oops. You guys hear me okay? Awesome. Thank you. First off, thanks for sticking with me. It's always fun being the last session of the day. I know you guys have been in here probably a long time, hearing all sorts of things, so I appreciate you showing up. I'm going to try to get us out of here on the scheduled time. I've got about 10 slides, 12 slides that I'm going to go through. Just set your expectations. I'm going to move fairly briskly through the first 6 or 7 of them, and then I'm going to start getting into more of the details. But feel free. I probably hold questions till the end, but I will be here and absolutely happy to answer them for you. All right, let's get started. Okay, so anybody that's going to be talking to you about AI or cybersecurity or any other super complex thing, I'd always encourage you to say, like, hey, who are these people? Are they qualified to be speaking to me about this? Do they know what's up? Okay. So I'll go very light on this, I promise you, but just so you know who we are, WWT is probably one of the largest technology companies you probably never heard of. We are a global $20 billion plus company based out of the Midwest, but we're privately held. We did no advertising until the last couple of years, and even then it's typically on CNBC or a PGA Tour type thing, just sticking the toe in the water kind of thing. And even though we have been around for 35 years, many of you, I think, are in the public sector space in some way, shape, or form, or education. These are areas that we've been in about 7 or 8, so it's a relatively newer area for us. But maybe more importantly, as it relates to AI and AI security, we've been doing that for over a decade. And again, back to the whole, like, do these guys know what they're talking about? How they've been doing it? We're 9 or I believe it's 10 years now, NVIDIA's Partner of the Year. I don't think anybody's sold more SuperPods globally than we have. We're Dell's North America and Federal AI Partner of the Year. We've done a ton of deployments. I'm helping Texas A&M right this second deploy their SuperPod and to build a security framework, which I'll chat just the slightest bit about later. So yeah. So before we get into kind of managing risk and privacy, let's talk about why we do this. Probably a lot of you know on some level, there's always the discussion about the productivity benefits of AI, right? And I would kind of chalk that up into a view being kind of what I call the administrative and operational view. And that spans every area. The images you're seeing up there on the screen speak a little bit to AI and education, but they're analogous benefits and functions across healthcare and government and other areas as well. And so lots of productivity improvements to be sure, but certainly also driving engagement, helping people figure out how to do things, where to do things accurately, and maybe on the first time instead of the 3rd time or the 5th time or the 7th time. But I would tell you that to get the best result, and there's a second view, which is more what I call the user-focused view. And in education, and again, this exists in the other areas as well because it looks a lot like training and development and things like that of staff and things. You've got experiential learning, right? You've got this new capability to learn in methods that really pace people at their speed, address multi-language challenges, all sorts of things in ways that we've been unable to do historically. But despite all of these advantages, we need to understand something. The best results often involve sharing sensitive information, right? And so that's on the input side, that's on the output side, that's between systems, and so we'll be breaking that down a little bit. So let's start with the exposure areas, really understanding risk and privacy. You need to start with understanding what are my exposure areas, right? And how many here are familiar with the OWASP organization? Yeah, quite a few. Okay. So you're probably very familiar with the OWASP Top 10 that's really focused on web application vulnerabilities in top 10 areas, and they continue to update that all the time. In 2023, they released a V1 of the top 10 for LLMs, top 10 vulnerabilities for LLMs, okay? This actually is the 2025 version, so it was recently updated for anyone who may not be tracking it as closely. But you still see a lot of the common suspects when it comes to what do the vulnerabilities look like. You know, you're dealing with everything from, you hear a lot about prompt injection and sensitive information disclosure, maybe less about excessive agency, things of that nature, or unbounded consumption when, you know, maybe a model or AI application run amok allows significant amounts of data to go out the door because intentionally or not, some user or some process, some agentic AI process basically changed the context in a way that allowed you know, your bounds to be exceeded and for additional data to be disclosed beyond what you intended, and additional amounts of data beyond what you intended to be disclosed. So really understanding the exposure areas is super important. And then really, you know, do you understand and appreciate the consequences of failure? So let's talk about, we'll talk about that in a minute. So how, as you see, kind of how are these vulnerabilities exploited? On the right side, you actually see a map that takes those LLM top 10 and maps it to common enablers. And it's definitely an eye chart for you, but I'll kind of talk you through it. In a lot of ways, it has to do with some very common themes, right? So inadequate visibility, that's been a challenge. A lot of these are traditional challenges. They've just been made orders of magnitude maybe more challenging as AI has come into the fold because of the speed and the dynamic nature of it, the way certain things morph, and the way that maybe business logic and other types of controls that we thought we could evaluate previously, we're having more challenges in evaluating going forward. But again, a lot of these are traditional challenges, right? Inadequate visibility, inadequate access and distribution control. So we'll talk a little bit more about on the risk management side, access and distribution. But it's not just IAM, it's not just, hey, does the user have the appropriate permissions to this, right? On a number of levels. First of all, do you understand what identity means in today's you know, AI world? And again, as we move into agentic AI, what has an identity, what doesn't, what does that mean? So that's a pretty foundational need. Unsafe code and model execution, again, runtime security and code vulnerabilities have been evaluated for quite some time, but the context with which we're evaluating it is evolving, and so it's becoming more difficult, and we're having to apply, or we're seeing where if you don't have AI helping enhance your defenses, then a lot of times you can't recognize particularly unsafe model execution. Insufficient input and output analysis, and that lack of formalized data and AI governance. So we'll talk about that more. So this is kind of my slide where I say, okay, that's all great and everything, but this is for the people that are like, you know, we're not there yet. We're kind of just starting to look into AI a little bit. We're maybe we're sticking, again, a toe in the water kind of thing. Well, let me tell you, as a security guy, that's been something I've become very familiar with, right? People saying, hey, we'll get to an appropriate amount of security eventually. Eventually become recognized as being important enough. But until then, they're not going to give us the budget we need. They're not going to give us the controls we need, whatever. I would tell you that there's a bit of a forcing function, as we like to say in consulting, that's going to happen. And it's going to make you have to cross that bridge sooner than later. And that's going to be that, if you're doing any sort of code development, the two most common uses of AI at this time are code development and chatbots, okay? So again, I've already talked a couple of times about the challenges of understanding and the threats of understanding if code is benign or malicious in an AI world, but also understanding, but also being able to use chatbots. And guess what? Chatbots, to give you the best results, a normal chatbot, when you say chatbot, and what most people do day one is they just stand one up and they say, hey, can we have it answer some basic questions? And the majority of the time it gets the answers to those questions fairly accurately. But it will often be wrong because it's typically going against some sort of universal corpus of data out there that extends well beyond your organizational data, so it lacks specifics. It can be wrong, and when it's wrong, that can have consequences, right? So you're going to turn to something called RAG, Retrieval Augmented Generative AI, to enhance your capability. And RAG is going to retrieve documents out of your document store, and it's going to index them, and it's going to come up then with the responses that it needs to get to people. Guess what? You see dramatic improvements in accuracy and usefulness of chatbots after you've leveraged RAG. But again, getting back to my last comment from the last slide, that's where your sensitive information is actually going to be disclosed, and so you need to be able to deal with that. And beyond that, there continues to be an acceleration in third-party information sharing and your ability to control data provenance, understanding where it came from, being able to track it through its use, even irrespective of things like data sovereignty. Those things are exposure areas. Okay. Last point I'd like to make before we kind of get into that, let's start trying to control for this thing is really understanding and appreciating, like I said, the consequences of failure here, right? So certainly we're seeing an increase in AI-enhanced attacks. Those attacks can cause operational outages. So that's ransomware attacks have become much more sophisticated and successful. Strong correlation with successful attacks. In the last year, as we've continued to see AI models add capability, as we've seen threat actors leverage those AI models, but also seen denial of service attacks where, particularly in our transportation and utility customers so far, and guess what, that's going to spill over, but this is just kind of where they're starting, for threat actors to actually effectively create denial of service attacks by using unbounded resource consumption. So they can apply AI to effectively make your own mechanism work against you in such a way that you have service outages, right? So that could be anything from your inability to process tax payments or to provide health services or whatever the case may be, to be able to, could be as a university your inability to process applications or all sorts of other things. Fraud is definitely a big issue. You'll see it doesn't take you very long to look into the headlines and find examples of billions of dollars being saved by a variety of governments that have started to apply AI to trying to protect themselves from fraud, but obviously that means that there was a significant portion of it that's being AI enabled by the threat actors to go out there. As you can see, one of the headlines on the right speaks to fraud being used to basically steal and divert benefits from students and recipients, financial aid and other things, by creating personalities and basically taking there and making changes to their contact info and other things that then diverts that financial aid, and they may never know about it, or applies for financial aid. In many scenarios, the most common scenario, and in fact the one this particular article was speaking to, was where it's applying for financial aid on their behalf, but they're not actually even students at the organization, right? So that those are funds that could be going to legitimate students that are being stolen. For my R1 institutions, research grant and funding is a significant source of revenues and reputation and other things for those organizations. For that information to go out the door, particularly if you're doing anything around DoD or anything else, can have significant funding and additional consequences and reputation hits. And then, of course, again, the third-party misuse and everything that goes along with that. All right, so let's talk about how we address it, or how we are addressing. Let's start with how are we addressing this now, right? I call these solutions, and you see there's an asterisk there because they're solutions with problems, right? So they've got issues, and those issues are going to become increasingly problematic. So, there's four of the most common ones there on the screen for you, for anyone that may have trouble reading them. Identity and access handling. What's the problem? How do we handle that traditionally? Well, there's usually manually or scripted birthright assignments for roles, right? Or if somebody needs some sort of privilege grant after the fact, then okay, we'll grant that. But the roles aren't typically as developed as we would like them to be. There's always change in the organization, people coming on, people moving laterally, people leaving. Maybe we're federating with other organizations, federated identities, and are we ever going to go back and actually revoke some of those additional privileges that we granted? Typically not. Improper use or sharing of data. The most common mechanism I see for dealing with this by far is, well, we've got policies against that. Well, guess what? Policies are very poor enforcement mechanisms. Okay. So you got to be able to do better than that, particularly in today's age. Protecting, the next two are interesting. I put them in there because some of the newest technologies are really, really interesting in these areas. But protecting improper data exposure. People are probably familiar with DLP and things like that, and some of the traditional responses have been to encrypt what you can, data at rest and in transit. And that applies to AI systems as well. But I would tell you, it's interesting because AI models typically can't actually do anything with encrypted prompts, right? They typically need clear text type prompts to be able to actually act on that information and to try to inference and things properly and to provide the proper responses. But that what we call that last mile in clear text on the compute side can be intercepted. In multi-tenant instances can lead to data leakage, inadvertent data leakage. So there's a bit of a gap there. I'll speak to how to address that in a little bit. Appropriate information sharing, and again, there's some manual. Typically, that's something where whether or not it's a research team or some other internal organization, they'll go through and they'll try to cut out information that's excessive, redact information, whatever the case may be. Try to just manually make sure, or through some basic semi-automated mechanism, control that it's the right data for the right parties. But again, the impact of that is that often you miss something and information gets out the door that shouldn't have gone, or there's actually a corresponding negative to that, which is sometimes you're actually redacting more information than you need to. So we see research institutions, particularly on the healthcare side, that actually are the medical records and things and the research associated with that are constrained in some ways because information that would have been useful is being redacted just because of concerns about that information potentially having excessive disclosure. And again, there are some technologies and things that we can talk about that will make that a little bit easier going forward. So let's start very broad as an approach about how we start to solve for it better. And this is not something that's probably new to anyone, but it's certainly a point that bears re-emphasizing, right? Which is that you need to look at this from an access and distribution perspective, and not just as a one-time event, but as an ongoing event. And by far the best mechanism or best approach to providing that sort of analysis from a risk perspective is zero trust, okay? So aligning with zero trust tenants, doing that continuous assessment of least privilege is super, super important, right? So when you start to break down the key pillars of zero trust, without getting down into the individual solutions and capabilities, identity, it's foundational. Like I said, your ability to share information is greatly impacted by whether or not the parties with whom you're sharing that information, whether or not they're actually who you think they are. And again, your challenge is not only that it's always been challenging, and now you've got agents, and agentic AI and AI that have some identity associated with them. So there are mechanisms that can extend that capability. Endpoint security, going beyond, hey, what is this? Is this executable malware or not, right? The ability at the endpoint to again participate in the identity analysis and determination, the ability for you to say, okay, I'm going to control resources at kind of your first capable point is super important. So you can device profiling and other types of information can contribute to stronger on-device capability. Network security. So unnecessarily large threat footprints, right? A significant portion of my customers have admittedly flatter networks than they feel like they should have, right? So you've got the ability to move laterally well beyond what you should have the capability to do. Beyond that, your ability to do that, how can you restrict that? Getting back to the endpoint side, there are certain types of solutions that will allow you to effectively make that determination at the endpoint, make that connection to specific applications or resources, and allows you to, in many ways, decouple the security and then layer 3, layer 4 type security concerns from the conversation, right? So you're really starting to enforce at the very front of the threat, at the threat lifecycle, and at the very end to kind of minimize your exposure area. So that's super important in traditional cybersecurity, and again, everything for all the reasons I've spoken to, more so in the AI world. Application security. So spoke a little bit to the code challenges before. API security, didn't talk about it a ton, but API security is a lot of organizations have trouble understanding what APIs they have out there, and where they're using them. Are they authenticating properly? Okay, again, that's kind of the key kind of first step, and a lot of times the answer is no, they are not authenticating properly. They're not constructed that way. If they are, they make some very basic business logic type determinations or information exchanges, but the ability to really understand what they're doing, particularly in an AI world, is difficult. And API gateways and API security tools cannot really address the challenges that LLMs are introducing. And then lastly, that visibility, encrypted traffic, the amount of encrypted traffic in organizations continues to grow. Anomalies are becoming more difficult to view. All of that. So let's talk about some mechanisms where we can kind of control that access, and then distribution, which is actually harder and requires even more of an ongoing basis. And there's a lot of not only technical solutions but governance solutions there that need to be understood. So are you continuing to audit and monitor beyond what the technical tools can provide you? So let's talk about some specific solutions here that I mentioned that there are some solutions. Let's talk about what some of those are. So there are increasing and new enhancements and capabilities associated with observability. So a focus on going beyond logs and getting into traces and other types of information. That additional information, now one side of it is you need to recognize that means you're going to have a data growth explosion in the amount of data that you store and these kind of things, and deal with that. But the reason you're doing that is, again, it's going to help you identify the anomalies and a lot of the other threats, but it's also going to it will allow you to do AI ops. And if anybody in here is familiar, or many of you talking about AI ops at the moment, anybody here an operational IoT guy? Okay, so AI ops will allow you to more proactively identify if something's becoming a problem, if you're going to potentially see cascade failures due to equipment, out of memory type situations or other scenarios. All those kind of things can be addressed, and all the data sources that you have coming in, all the systems and all the applications and those kind of things feeding these logs in can be very strongly correlated, so that you can actually get to the signal and not the noise, right? Which allows your IT organization to be more, the data is more actionable, and allows you, again, not only to head stuff off before it becomes a problem, but when it does become a problem, for you to recover more quickly. Super important and great benefit of going through that pain. Microsegmentation, ZTNA. I talked a little bit earlier about the overly flat networks and things like that. You absolutely must look at ways that you can introduce the concepts of microsegmentation into your organization. And at the most technical level, that does allow you to potentially leverage things like I mentioned, on device and at the application level, And for unmanaged devices, to use things called like site connectors and that kind of technical stuff that I won't get into any greater detail. But to allow, like I said, to make a determination whether or not this should have access, this identity or user should have access to that resource, and to decouple the network conversation. And by the way, that lets your networking guys that are overworked and already can be a bottleneck sometimes, lets them do the things that they need to do to grow capacity and do some other things. So another good reason. Robust data discovery and classification. Data discovery and classification has been a historic challenge. Virtually every organization underestimates the amount of change associated with data, and data ends up being in places. Certain types of data end up in places that people don't anticipate it being over time. So your ability to deal with that, it's very difficult historically, but as AI has gotten better, the ability to actually for it to tell you what data is where has greatly improved, right? So in many ways, it's a much better starter kit than what it used to be historically. So instead of you having to go through and try to do it, or instead of having a couple hundred labels that it tried to apply to based on whether or not a 3-2-4 character string was a social security number or not, it would allow you to address that much more quickly and effectively. Mentioned that API gateways were falling short. LLM gateways enhance the capabilities of API gateways. If that's an area that you may be an exposure area for you, I'd encourage you to look at LLM gateways, because they can apply guardrails to those prompts and basically cut off inputs that could potentially be dangerous, as well as doing the API business logic analysis for these more complicated type queries and APIs, and can also do some checking of the output to identify if there's a potential unbounded situation or whatever the case may be. Client-server data transforms. Mentioned the last mile exposure of data earlier. How the models really need clear text to be able to process information, and that's an exposure area of risk. There are actually mechanisms that allow you to, there's new solutions out there that allow you to apply transforms, and effectively, at the risk of oversimplifying it, it obfuscates, it supplies one-way transforms to that information where the models can still use the obfuscated data, and then they can still act and perform. Basically at the other end, it will be turned back into legible clear text for the user. So the user, it's completely transparent, they don't see it, but that last mile is covered. And that also helps you address leakage when you have multi-tenant AI pods and things like that, where you'd worry about some bleed. And lastly, again, I mentioned that there's an organizational component of this. AI and data governance centers of excellence to deal with that ongoing change. Because of time, I won't go into all the details, but that's a super important mechanism for this cross-functional team to be able to say, what data decisions are we making? Are we taking more risk than we should? Are we monitoring what we should? And things of that nature. Last couple. The point I want to make here is when we originally produced the site, it was for two reasons. It was because we had a lot of people doing things, activities. Okay, and I would tell you that most of what I've spoken to actually previously was an approach, a zero trust approach, or just general activities. Activities need to be in alignment with a framework. Okay, the strategy optimally, your frameworks are aligned with your strategy, your approaches align with your framework, which is really an operational architecture, as it were, and then your technical architecture hopefully supports all the above. And we've had customers who often get analysis paralysis, or they have a technical team that's holding up progress, and so you can't really do that. You need to understand how these things relate to each other, and you can make progress in each of these areas. It doesn't all have to be solved for from day one, but they work together. So key takeaways. As you can see, tremendous benefits and opportunity with AI, but it comes with significant risk. That's no shock to any of you. Plan to operate as a strategy, not plan to implement. Okay, you have to have that ongoing understanding of use case prioritization and how anticipating change and having the appropriate bodies for that ongoing governance function. Absolutely. Framework. I talked about the importance of a framework. There are some out there, NIST AI risk management framework and others. I would tell you that they're generally, though, tend to be not as prescriptive as we would like them to be at the moment. They're either very broad or they're just a collection of controls, and they don't really they're not actually a real framework. I will tell you, I'm not clear to talk about it yet because there will be an announcement, but we've been working with some of our largest customers and our partners for some time on a framework, secure AI foundational framework that will be announced in about a month more publicly. And I would encourage you to look out for that because it will have, half dozen domains from the data side up to the governance side, SDLC and secure AI operations and things like that. It will also have prioritized controls and things of that nature. I think it will be very good for everyone. Approach, talked about zero trust today, I won't talk about that. Technical architecture, you guys can probably see the rest of this. Last two slides. These are just resources. So I just want to let everyone know, if you need a space, whether or not you're currently well down the AI path or whether or not you're just starting, getting those resources, particularly if you want to bring them in-house, there's long lead times and you got to have cooling and power and all that kind of thing as you scale. We have an AI proving ground that's an actual physical space in a multi-million square foot facility that we've had operating for over a decade, where we built out, we've got NVIDIA SuperPods and AMD and Dell pods and Cisco pods and all that kind of stuff, and we can stand up playgrounds for you to train. We've got A&M staff learning how to use their pod before their pod actually gets here and that kind of thing. And when their pod comes live, guess what? And this isn't exclusive to A&M. You have to it's going to go into production right away. So you need a testing ground. So this is the type of resource that's available to you. More generally, if you're not down that road yet, I would tell you, come see us. If you go to wwt.com, you don't have to be a customer. You can actually log in or register for an account if you like. And there are hundreds and hundreds of on-demand labs that deal with a lot of this technology, hundreds more that are behind a wall that if you reach out to one of us, we can maybe make available to you. There may be a customer that a defense or financial or healthcare or a municipal customer that's in a lab that's not yet ready for public disclosure, but we can maybe get access to that technology for you and disclose it and make it available on a sanitized basis for you. But learning paths and all sorts of other great information there. It's a pretty unique thing that we have and we offer, and you don't have to be a customer, although you can leverage lab as a service or do some other things in there if you want to as a customer. All right, guys, I went right up and maybe a little bit over, but I started a little late, so I hope you guys will forgive me. Thank you for the time. I'll be around, and I'll take questions if anybody has any. Thanks again.